Photography advice is full of things that sound sensible but quietly waste years of your life. I should know because I've been taking photos for almost 20 years now, and for a good number of those years I followed most of them like a total mug. So instead of making another 10 tips to improve your photography video, these are 10 photography tips that wasted years of my life and what I wish I'd ignored so much sooner. So starting with the one that cost me the most money, and that's the idea of sharpness equals quality. Now, like many other beginners in my early days, I became absolutely obsessed with sharpness. I convinced myself that if my photos weren't tack sharp at 200 magnification, then they basically were unusable, which conveniently meant that I obviously needed to buy better lenses. Surely that would fix everything, right?
Wrong.
Turns out I just ended up spending hundreds buying sharper glass, and then even sharper glass, and then even sharper glass, you know, just to be safe. And at the end of it all, I quickly realized that it made absolutely no difference. Sure, my photos were sharper than the black Sharpie redactions failing to hide the big names in the Epstein files, but they were also absolute trash, almost as bad as the former Prince Andrew's shitty excuses for being in the Epstein files.
I didn't sweat at the time because I had suffered what I would describe as an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War when I was shot at.
Look, what I'm trying to say is that I soon figured out that a sharp image does not automatically mean that it will be a good image. Now, this is not me saying that sharpness is totally irrelevant, because yes, obviously, completely blurred, misfocused photos aren't much use to anyone. But even the cheapest lenses you can buy these days are plenty sharp enough. I even made an entire video ranking 12 of the cheapest full-frame lenses that are fully autofocus and cost under $200 just to prove this point. And spoiler alert, they're all plenty sharp enough. In fact, some of the most impactful photos that I've ever taken are actually slightly soft, a bit messy, and technically imperfect, and yet they stick because the feeling they give you quickly overrides the technical imperfections. Look, if sharpness was the key, lens review videos on YouTube would be made up of some of the greatest photographs ever taken, and tragically, they are not. And that's coming from someone who made a living testing lenses for many years. Anyway, moving on, and this next piece of advice is something that I followed for years, and as it turns out, it was actually something that I kind of told myself in a way, rather than anyone directly giving me this advice. And that's the idea that editing will just fix everything. In the past, I would take a photo that was, you know, fine, but rather than taking an extra minute or two to try again and improve upon it, I would just tell myself, it's fine, I'll fix it in the editing. And that was largely because I was way more confident with my editing abilities than I was with my photography skills. But the problem is that editing doesn't create magic. It only really stands to amplify what's already there. It's the sauce on a burger, it's the maple syrup on your pancakes, it's the jizz at a bukkake. It's important, yes, but no amount of sauce fixes a dry one, if you catch my drift. Look, if the photo wasn't really good enough to begin with, then editing it will only give you a cleaner, more expensive looking version of, well, nothing. This belief is especially damaging early on because it pushes your attention in the wrong direction. Instead of learning how to see things better, you end up treating editing like a rescue mission, and that is how photography quickly turns into extra homework. Now, this doesn't mean that editing isn't important. It obviously is, but it's the second half of the process, not the foundation. I soon learned that if I just spent a little bit more time trying to get the photo right in camera first, I quickly stopped relying on editing to save weak photos. And as a result, my hit rate went up, my photography became more rewarding, and it all stopped feeling like unpaid graphic design work. So this next one is something that I see a lot of people calling out online, and it's even something I convinced myself for many years. And that's the idea that good photos only come from good locations. And if that's something that you've told yourself before, look, I get it. I was actually born and raised in a town that was repeatedly ranked as one of the worst places to live in England for several years in a row. So I naturally grew up feeling like I was handed a huge disadvantage over other photographers who happened to be born in way more interesting cities. But fast forward to, well, now, and I'm lucky enough to live in Calgary, a city that is often ranked as one of the best places to live, and I can tell you now, good photos are just as hard to capture here as they were when I lived in the UK. Because what I've learned is the problem isn't that most places are boring, it's either the place that you live just doesn't inspire inspire you for whatever reason, or you don't really know what you're looking for yet. Because good location doesn't mean nice looking. More often than not, it actually means that interesting things are happening. Look, for me, a car park filled with people arguing over a parking space is a better location than a perfect sunset with nothing going on. Now, that's just what excites me personally, and what defines a good location for you will entirely depend on the kind of photos you want to take. If you shoot landscapes, for example, visually stunning places will matter a lot more, obviously. But if you shoot people, moments, or street photography like I do, then the only thing that matters is human behavior, and human behavior happens everywhere, even in your boring hometown, if you know where to look for it. But the point is, once I stopped blaming my surroundings and started paying attention to what people were actually doing, my photos improved without having to travel anywhere new. Now, this next one might be a tiny bit controversial, but please do hear me out. I was told very early on that if I wanted to be a real photographer, whatever that is, I needed to be original. I needed to find my own style and develop my own voice. Explicitly, I was told that I should never copy other people's work, which I get sounds noble, but in practice, it's completely useless advice when you're just starting out. In fact, I would go so far as to say that you should actively copy other people's work, and here's why. Look, in short, if you don't copy anyone, you've got nothing to aim at. You're just wandering around with a camera hoping originality magically happens, which is like trying to write a novel without ever reading a book. The truth is, copying is exactly how you learn any new skill. Musicians copy songs, artists copy paintings, politicians copy whatever the last guy said and polled well. Photography is absolutely no different. Now look, I fully understand that me telling you to copy everyone else's work is incredibly taboo, and if I keep talking about it, sooner or later the morality police will turn up somewhere in the comments section and we won't hear the end of it. So instead, let's use a less triggering term and call it taking inspiration. Are you with me? So when you decide to take inspiration from other photographers, you are not stealing their soul. What you're actually doing is learning by imitation so that you can figure out what does and what doesn't work for you. And this is absolutely fine to do so long as you do it with respect and don't try and claim your work as original. But look, there's also another crucial mistake you can make here, and that's never stopping to imitate others. If you spend 10 years recreating other people's shots, congratulations, you're now a very competent human photocopier, and to my knowledge, photocopiers have never won a Pulitzer Prize. Point is, originality doesn't come from outright refusal to copy. It actually comes from copying enough that you eventually know what to keep and what to leave behind, and that is how you create your own style and look. So this next one probably cost me and many others more money than all of the points we've talked about so far combined. And that's the idea that you need to own the latest and greatest gear in order to produce the best possible results. So for years, I genuinely believed that if my photos weren't improving, the problem must be my gear. The camera wasn't fast enough, the sensor was maybe not good enough in low light, the autofocus wasn't quite there yet, so naturally the solution was buy a newer camera. And look, I'm not pretending that gear doesn't matter at all, because it does, but what I've come to learn is that modern cameras are so good now that upgrading rarely fixes the thing that people think it will. In fact, in a lot of cases, it actually makes things worse. That's because the newer and more optimized cameras get, the more likely they are to turn you into a passenger rather than the driver. When a camera is so advanced that it can decide what to focus on, what exposure looks the best, and then it can fire off thousands of shots in a second, allowing you to cherry pick the absolute perfect moment rather than actually learning how to wait for it. Before you know it, your role as the photographer has been reduced to pointing the thing vaguely in the right direction and convincing yourself that you actually did something creative. Now, don't get me wrong here. There are certain situations where you might need that level of effectiveness. For example, for paid work, where the only thing that really matters is getting the end result for the client, using technology that is near faultless isn't lazy, it's just an insurance policy. But if photography is your fun thing to do away from work, then getting a super flashy camera is the quickest way to sap the soul out of it. That's why I would almost always suggest buying an older camera over a brand spanking new one, and I don't mean some ancient relic that still takes AA batteries, well, unless you're into that kind of torture, but just anything that's a few generations back will be enough to force you to actually drive. Sure, you might have to think a bit more, and you might have to make decisions instead of outsourcing them to an AI algorithm, but that friction is where learning lives. Plus, when you break the cycle of constantly chasing the next new body, you also stop blaming the tool and start fixing the actual problem, which is usually the decision you're making behind the camera. And of course, buying used tends to be a hell of a lot cheaper too. Now, I appreciate that's rich coming from a shill YouTuber piece of shit like me who gets everything given to them for free on a plate, but when I do actually dip my hands into my own pockets, which is actually more often than the comment section would have you believe, I almost never buy brand new stuff because it's just so much cheaper buying used. In fact, one method I use a lot to save even more money when I'm buying used gear is buying stuff directly from Japan rather than here in North America. How do I do that? Well, I actually use a service called Buyee, who also happen to be the sponsors of this episode. Now, whilst Buyee have kindly helped to support this channel by sponsoring this video, I do genuinely use this service all of the time. And if you don't already know, Buyee is a proxy site that lets you browse and bid on Japanese auctions like Yahoo Auctions, Mercari, and Rakuten, and they do all of this by translating these Japanese auctions into English or a choice of other languages. Once you win a bid, Buyee also help you to handle the shipping process too. That includes arranging for the item to be shipped to one of their warehouses where it will be inspected to make sure it's actually as described on the auction, packaging it all up securely afterwards, and forwarding the item straight to your doorstep. You can even bundle multiple items together into a single parcel to help reduce shipping costs, and they ship worldwide. It's completely free to sign up and browse, so if you want to check out Buyee for yourself, I've dropped a link in the pinned comment below and also in the video description. Okay, so for this next one, I'm sure you've all heard this one before, but it seems to be a piece of advice that absolutely refuses to die for some reason, so it's been added to the list. And that's the notion that if you want to be a real photographer, you need to ditch auto mode and learn how to shoot in full manual. Look, I'll keep this one short. Learning how to expose correctly is important, obviously. Understanding what aperture, shutter speed, and ISO does absolutely matters. But shooting in full manual mode all of the time for most people, especially early on, is largely a total waste of time and energy. All it really teaches you is how to be a human light meter, not a photographer. You end up spending your entire shoot staring at numbers, tweaking dials, second-guessing yourself, and missing important moments. Also that you can feel morally superior in some weird way to anyone else who's using semi or fully automatic modes. Meanwhile, the camera you're holding in your actual hands could have done the same job in about half a second if you just let it do its thing. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't mean that manual mode is totally useless. It obviously has its place for stuff like astrophotography or studio work or using off-camera flash. All of those things will likely require you to dial things in manually. But for 90% of everyday photography like street, travel, portraits, pet photography, snapshots of everyday life happening, full manual offers absolutely no advantage. Like, at all. So my advice instead, having gone through this myself, is just learn the exposure triangle properly, then just do what every other sane photographer does and let the camera do some of the heavy lifting for you by using one of the semi-automatic modes. Personally, I shoot almost exclusively with aperture priority mode because it lets me dial in the aperture, which allows me to control what's actually in focus and what's not, and then I let the camera handle the boring maths. That frees up my attention to focus on what the camera can't do for me, and that's judging timing, composition, and capturing the moment, which, funnily enough, is actually what photography is all about. Now look, this next one is a little bit sneaky because nobody actually tells you this out loud, but nearly everyone I know just sort of convince themselves of it over time, myself included. And that's the idea that every photo you take needs to be a banger. This is probably the most damaging piece of advice we believe as photographers today, and it's just not realistic. The issue is, if you look at just about any photographer's work online these days, it's composed of only their greatest hits in a perfectly curated feed. And without realizing it, you soon internalize the idea that every photo you take and post online needs to matter. Every frame has to be a borderline award-winning shot, and that you need to justify its existence or you and the photo you've just taken are total trash. Funnily enough, a little while ago, I actually had some guy comment on a post that I made telling me that I wasn't worthy of the title of photographer because most of the images that I post, in his opinion, aren't good enough. Yeah, well, thanks for the input, Dad. And send mum all my love. Look, personally, I don't take photos to try and impress anyone. I take photos because I actually want to take photos, and if in the process I get a shot that I'm proud of or somebody else happens to like, then that gives me a little dopamine hit that my tiny little brain will appreciate. Nothing more than that. Adopting the mindset that every outing needs to produce something worth keeping is absolutely brutal. It means that every photo carries pressure, and with it, photography stops being playful and starts feeling like an audition. The truth is, most photos you take aren't meant to be bangers. They're more like reps in the gym. Even photographers you admire most are taking loads of completely forgettable photos every day. You just never see them because nobody posts their warm-up laps. If you expect every frame to be a masterpiece, you'll either burn yourself out or stop pressing the shutter altogether, or you'll turn into a clone of the aforementioned judgmental prick in my comments section who I almost guarantee doesn't get invited to family parties anymore and still can't figure out why. So I guess the advice here is just give yourself permission to take average photos, and lots of them. Don't see them as a failure, but as part of the process. Because the real truth is that the only people who never take bad or boring photos are also the ones who don't take any photos at all. And that nicely leads us on to point 8, which is the idea that getting more feedback about your photography will allow you to improve faster. Now, this is another one that sounds sensible until you actually live it, like I did for a while. At some point, like I did, you may convince yourself that if you want to improve faster, you just need to get more feedback. So, living in the age of the internet, as we all do, you throw your photos into Facebook groups, forums, subreddits, anywhere with a pulse, and you wait for the jury to come back with a verdict. The problem is, you always get one of two people. On one end, you've got the people who are just trying to be nice at any cost. They'll shower you in praise, which feels good for about 5 seconds and then does absolutely nothing for your growth, besides, growing your ego and the size of your balls. Or, more frequently, you'll experience the other end of the spectrum in a category I call the bitter cunts. Now, these are the people that ironically couldn't take a meaningful photo if their life depended on it, but somehow speak with the aura of a Pulitzer Prize winner. I actually vividly remember the last time I ever posted in a Facebook group, and it was because I got absolutely ripped to shreds by somebody online who went to town telling me how bad my color work was, how sloppy my composition was, and just basically talking to me as if my photography had personally stormed into their house and punched their mother square in the throat. Now, initially, being the person I am, I took what they said on board. I figured that maybe they had a point and I was perhaps just totally out of touch without even realizing it. Well, that thought process stopped the moment I decided to take a look at the commenter's own work. As it turns out, he was just some random 20-year-old who worked at a bike repair shop full-time and took photos on his iPhone at the weekends, posting his portfolio on Instagram, which consisted entirely of blurry, oversaturated images of park benches and other meaningless snapshots. Point is, neither of these groups are useful. One feeds your ego and the other one feeds your anxiety, and neither makes you a better photographer at the end of it. Good feedback comes from people who actually understand what you're trying to do. And if getting feedback is something you absolutely need in order to grow, then my advice would be to find a small group of people whose work you actually respect and who genuinely want to see you improve. That kind of feedback is gold. Everything else is just noise. Anyway, this next one is technically good advice, but it's just a little bit incomplete. You'll see what I mean. And that's the advice that you should shoot what you love. Yes, you should absolutely shoot what you love. If you don't enjoy what you're photographing, you're not going to stick with it for very long. But the mistake I made, and what I see a lot of other people making, is taking that advice way too literally, and they end up only ever shooting what feels comfortable and what they already know, and that's where progress quietly stalls. Growth doesn't really come from staying in the same lane forever. Some of the most useful things that I've learned as a photographer came from shooting things I didn't love at the time. But every time I did it, I walked away with something valuable, even if I never planned to shoot that genre ever again. The most recent example of that would be shooting car photography with my good friend Alex McKinns. He's a car nut who drives a Porsche, and I own a 2013 Hyundai Santa Fe, which should say everything about my admiration for cars. Shout out to all the Santa Fe owners out there. But when he invited me to go out to shoot some fancy cars with him, I said yes, because it was something I'd never done before, and I thought I'd probably learn something in the process, which I absolutely did. Shooting what you don't love isn't about forcing yourself to suffer just for the sake of it. It's about expanding your skill set so that when you do shoot what you love, you're better at it. Think of it a bit like cross-training, but for photography. So I've saved the best until last, because this one actually nearly made me hate photography altogether. At some point, I'd convinced myself that if I wanted to take this seriously, I needed to always have my camera with me. I'm talking every single walk, every family trip, every outing, because in my mind, that's what real serious photographers do. And for a while, I lugged a camera around with me all of the time, even when I really didn't want to. I forced myself to shoot when I wasn't in the mood, and I turned ordinary life into a constant scavenger hunt for photos. And all it did was drain the absolute fun out of all of it and meant I wasn't present at times in my life where I really should have just put the camera down and engaged with my family and friends. Photography stopped being something I wanted to do and started feeling like something I had to do out of some weird obligation. And if I didn't, I was just failing. But over time, I learned that you don't need to take photos all of the time to be a photographer. You just need to take photos when you actually want to. Yes, sometimes having a camera on you means that you'll catch something unexpected, and that's brilliant. But constantly carrying one out of guilt or some weird sense of obligation is the fastest way to turn photography into a chore. You don't lose your identity as a photographer because you left the camera at home. You lose it when you stop enjoying the act of taking photos altogether, which very nearly happened to me. So the advice here would be to take your camera with you when you feel drawn to something, because that's when your best photos will happen anyway. And if that means sometimes walking out the door with nothing more than your smartphone and your thoughts, that isn't failure. That's actually being pretty smart.